Who's trading for Kyle Pitts? Oh, I think there will be quite a robust trade market when the offseason begins.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. Knowles, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. AKA. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me each and every day, right? That means you are an everydayer, right? And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcast. So today we'll talk about what it means for the Falcons salary cap situation, with the league setting their estimate range of what the salary cap will be this offseason and how that impacts the Falcons' decisions. But the bulk of today's conversation is going to be following on the heels of something that our guest yesterday, Josh Kendall of The Athletic, said when I asked him about, what about trading Kyle Pitts as a way for the Falcons to shift their roster, adjust their roster, create cap space, up to $11 million by making that trade. And Josh said, who's trading for Kyle Pitts? And I understand where Josh is coming from with that, but I think there's going to be a little bit more of a robust trade market. I'll explain why on today's episode, but sort of going where Josh is coming from, I understand it. Teams will have options this offseason at the tight end position. So it's not as if everybody's going to be coming to bang down the Falcons' door when it comes to Kyle Pitts. It's a deep draft class at that position by all accounts. And when we talk about the reasons why the Falcons would want to trade Kyle Pitts, it's something I've mentioned already on this podcast a couple of times now. It's really about given the current state of the situation. We'll see how things change in the coming weeks, months, and or years. But at this stage, it feels like there's a very low probability that the Falcons are going to re-sign Kyle Pitts to a second contract as he heads into the final year of his rookie contract in 2025. And so it's the idea of get something for him now that you're probably not going to be able to get for him later. And the reason why I think another team would be willing to trade for Kyle Pitts, because you kind of get into the front of the line when it comes to potentially locking up Kyle Pitts long-term and getting that locked up to that second contract. But as I said, I don't know if there's going to be a team chomping at the bit at that point, to do that, to jump ahead of the line with Kyle Pitts. As Josh said, like, you can probably wait a year and sort of make a more informed decision in 2026 when Kyle Pitts hits free agency to sort of see, does he have a bounce back year, a breakout year in 2025 that will merit him, getting a big deal next offseason. But again, I do think the market for Kyle Pitts, as far as trade goes, is going to be a little bit more robust. I think there will be plenty of teams that will call. The question is just going to be, will those teams be willing to make it worth the Falcons' while in order to facilitate that trade, right? And so I look at the ideal value that you would want if you're the Falcons, and you would probably be like, hey, you pick up that phone, they say we're offering this, and you go like, sure, we'll think about it. And then you hang up the phone and you start, Terry starts moonwalking in that war room in his offense. So I think the ideal trade for that is probably a 3rd round pick in this 2025 draft, right? You look at the TJ Hawkinson trade 2 years ago with the Minnesota Vikings, another top 10 pick that didn't quite live up to the hype early in his career with the Detroit Lions over those first, 3 seasons. And then he got traded for a 2nd round pick, or he got traded for a bunch of picks, but I think it ultimately worked out to be basically a 2nd round pick. And so, I don't know if Kyle Pitts is, at that stage based off of the last couple of years. So I think you could probably ideally get him for a 3rd, a round less than what the Hawkinson trade. Again, a 4th round pick, I think, is also definitely a possibility. I think if you're not getting more than a 4th round pick, or a 4th round pick at the very minimum, if you're only getting a 5th round or 6th round offer, which I've seen a lot of people float out there this offseason, I don't think that's worth the Falcons' while. But when we talk about why I think it's going to be a robust market, like let's look at it from other teams' perspective, something that we do on Locked On Falcons, not just purely from the Falcons' perspective. And I think there were 3 teams that kind of stand out as teams that I could see making a call to the Falcons and trying to trade for Kyle Pitts. That's the Cincinnati Bengals, the Denver Broncos, and Indianapolis Colts. I think all 3 of those teams have needs at the tight end position. Cincinnati has Mike Gesicki. He's an impending free agent coming off a productive year. By all accounts, they want him back, but he's also the top free agent on a very, very, very thin free agent market at the tight end position. And so if he does wind up signing elsewhere, potentially Cincinnati's going to be a little bit more eager to make that phone call to Atlanta, right? And then if you're Terry Fontenot, you're like, hey, Cincinnati, just spitballing here, you're a certain player that is a high-profile player that wants out, wants to get paid by the name of Trey Hendrickson. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Do you have the money with T. Higgins franchise tag, with the Jamar Chase contract coming up? Do you feel like you have the money to drop, the $25 to $30 million on Trey Hendrickson, given that he's, approaching 30 years old? We'll take him off your hands, right? And again, this is the time of year, at least on this podcast, that we'll sit here and throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks, right? It's more of a hypothetical. I don't think you'll get a straight up Kyle Pitts for Trey Hendrickson trade, because I would imagine the Falcons would need to sweeten that pot, because I would imagine a straight up trade for Trey Hendrickson, you would have to give up a second and something, a second and a fourth, a second and a fifth, or something like that. And then a straight up Kyle Pitts trade, again, the best case scenario is probably a third. So maybe if you're the Falcons, you get Trey Hendrickson, you send them Kyle Pitts, and maybe like a conditional third in next year's draft. Again, spitballing here, but certainly I think worth a conversation, right? Denver is another team. We've already talked on Mock Draft Monday earlier this week about Denver trading up to get a tight end in this draft because they want a quote-unquote joker, according to Sean Payton, which is a elite pass-catching running back or tight end. Does Kyle Pitts fit that description? That's debatable, but certainly you can make a better case for Kyle Pitts in that role than maybe some other options. And we've seen what a Jimmy Graham could do in the Sean Payton offense. We've seen Jared Cook and others, and you're sort of looking at that and you're saying, hey, Kyle Pitts offers a similar skill set. And again, if you're the Falcons, at least you take the temperature and say, like, Denver, we would love a draft pick, but, Nick Bonito's going into a contract year. You just paid Jonathan Cooper. Are you going to pay 2 edge rushers? Throw a guy our way. Throw us a bone. So, again, you're just taking the temperature. Again, I'm not saying that you could trade that straight up, but at least if you're Terry Fontenot, you're going to ask about it. That's all I'm saying. And then, you look at the Colts. Their tight end room is pretty much barren. Mo Alley Cox, Kylan Granson, they're impending free agents. Jelani Woods, who they drafted in the 3rd round a couple of years ago, missed the last 2 years of injury. Andrew Ogletree is a blocking tight end. Will Mallory is just kind of a backup at this point. So they have probably a big need. And of these 3 teams, they're probably the team that I think makes the most sense to trade for someone like a Kyle Pitts, especially given that he adds that verticality in their offense where Alec Pierce is really the only deep threat in that offense. You have Anthony Richardson, give him another option. Pierce is going to a contract year, so it's like you give him 2 vertical options, see who he clicks with. Anthony Richardson, that is, assuming, he's the long-term answer at the quarterback. That's another concern with the Colts. And so, to me, it makes sense for them to at least kick the tires on Kyle Pitts. And again, if you're Terry, you're just like, hey, where are you at with Kwity Paye? You just drafted Laiatu Latu. Are you going to pay Kwity Paye? He's going into a contract year. What's that all about? Let's talk about it. So all of those things, I think, make sense for the Falcons and some of these teams to come calling for Kyle Pitts. But again, I don't think you're going to have any teams banging down the Falcons door to trade for Kyle Pitts. And I think that speaks to what Josh was talking about on yesterday's episode. And you look at all these teams, they're kind of in prime position at this point to, take a tight end in round 1. There are 2 at the top of this draft, Tyler Warren of Penn State, Colston Loveland of Michigan. They're the guys that are consistently mocked in the 1st round. The Colts have the 14th overall pick. The Bengals have the 17th. And the Broncos have the 20th overall pick. And so, again, any of these teams could have an opportunity to get one of these guys, but maybe these guys go earlier in this draft. This draft is going to be a weird one, right? When it comes to where these guys, like Daniel Jeremiah just put out a mock draft that had Tyler Warren going number 7 to the Jets. I've seen other mock drafts that have the Saints taking a tight end in the top 10, right? Colston Loveland went to the Denver in that mock draft from DJ. But, because there's a lot more uncertainty about the draft, I think that's going to affect the potential trade market for Kyle Pitts. And I think that's worth discussing further. And we'll talk about kind of the timeline on what we could look at in terms of when teams might be a little bit more willing to, engage in serious trade talks with Kyle Pitts, as well as some other teams that I think would be willing to make that phone call for Kyle Pitts. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you missed that opening tip-off, or you just, are there for that fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for that bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. And why not start, with the Hawks taking on the Magic on Thursday night, where you can place a $5 bet and get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet. So whether you want to bet on the Hawks, whether you want to bet on the Magic, whoever is coming off this All-Star break, who's going to get this thing rolling and get that ball rolling to make that playoff push, whichever team you want to go, you can do that at FanDuel.com. So head on over there to FanDuel to join today. And again, make sure you use that $5 bet if you win to get your shot at $150. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Because of the depth of this tight end class, again, I think a lot of teams will be maybe playing the waiting game when it comes to discussing a Kyle Pitts trade, right? Again, the reasons, if you're a team out there, that you would want to trade for Kyle Pitts is you're getting him in the final year of his contract and you're jumping in the front of the line to potentially extend him and get a long-term answer at that position. And again, when you compare some of the options that you may have, if you're giving up, a mid-round pick, a third or fourth round option, you compare Kyle Pitts to what you could get in this year's draft at this stage. It's not to say that you're guaranteed to get a better player in Kyle Pitts, but you're getting a discount on the type of player that Kyle Pitts is, as well as a guy that's probably a little bit more ready-made to produce right away, right? You look at some of these day two options once you get past Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland, a lot of the guys that are being projected to go in that day two range, Elijah Arroyo of the University of Miami, Harold Fannin Jr. of Bowling Green, Mason Taylor of LSU, Gunnar Helm of Texas. And then, of course, with the combine coming up, you'll get a couple of guys that maybe run a 4.6, and all of a sudden we might be talking about a few more names in this, day two mix. That's what happened with Jelani Woods when the Colts took him in the third round. He ran a 4.6, at the 2022 combine, and all of a sudden people were talking about him as, a day two pick and whatnot. But the problem is with these rookie tight ends, Brock Bowers, Kyle Pitts, and, maybe Sam Laporta withstanding, generally rookie tight ends aren't that impactful, right? And so, if you're going to wait until day two of the draft, you're probably not going to get a guy that's going to come in and produce right away, right? Again, Sam Laporta being the exception to that, who was a second round pick a couple of years ago and went out, I think when you factor in the playoffs, had a 1,000-yard season. I think had 900 yards in the regular season, right? But most of these rookie tight ends, outside of basically Laporta, Bowers, and Pitts, they're getting like 300, 400 yards as rookies. And so when you look at a player like Kyle Pitts, even if he's not any more productive than he has been the last 3 years in Atlanta, it's pretty much his floor is probably a 600-yard tight end. That's a borderline top 10, top 12 sort of tight end. And so that's the type of player that you can expect to get right away, even if you're not able to get more out of Kyle Pitts than what the Falcons have over the last couple of years. And if you do think you can get more out of Kyle Pitts, you're potentially doubling or tripling the production that you could expect out of a Harold Fanning Jr. or Mason Taylor in 2025. So to me, when I imagine this potential Kyle Pitts scenario, if he's going to get moved, I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. I don't think we're going to get to March 12th when the league year starts and boom, they're announcing a Kyle Pitts trade, right? Like we saw a couple of years ago when the Falcons traded for Jonnu Smith, where that news, I think, broke a couple of days before the start of the league year. But I think if Kyle Pitts is going to get moved, it's going to be a little bit closer to draft time, right? As I think teams kind of sort out and stack their options, right? It could be after the draft where a team gets kind of left out in the cold with some of these young tight ends and goes in a different direction on draft day and then decides that they want to pick up that phone. But I think if you're the Falcons, if you are going to move Kyle Pitts, you want to move him prior to this upcoming draft so you can get the picks now, right? That are going to help you in 2025 as opposed to waiting for those picks to help you in 2026. Because if you're Terry Fontenot and company, you're not guaranteed to be around to use those draft picks in 2026. And so, it could be one of those situations where, the tight ends go off the board in round 1 on Thursday night. And then some of those teams that maybe were looking at trying to get a tight end in round 1 or sort of looking at their options and being like, hey, we're a lot more interested, a lot more eager in Kyle Pitts at that point. And then, we get to Friday night with day 2 of the draft and, maybe that trade gets announced at that point in time. So I don't expect, a Kyle Pitts trade to come immediately at the beginning of the offseason. It may be something that we have to wait until April or the end of April to see happen. But we've talked about 3 teams that it does make some sense, at least from my perspective, for them to call about Kyle Pitts, but they're not the only teams, right? There's a bunch of other teams. Kansas City, right? A lot of talk about what happens if Travis Kelce retires. They just gave Noah Gray, the backup tight end, a multi-year contract this past season, right? But, they'll probably be in the market to take a tight end regardless of what happens with Travis Kelce this year, just to give him another option. But would it hurt Kansas City to take a 1-year flyer on Kyle Pitts? You have Noah Gray. Why not see if Kyle Pitts is worthwhile, a long-term solution for Travis Kelce and whatnot? Baltimore, Mark Andrews turns 30 in September. He's entering a contract year. There's been some speculation that he might be a cap cut this offseason, right? Todd Monken, pair Kyle Pitts with Isaiah Lockley, give Lamar another weapon. Likely's also going into a contract year. So, you get another option there, another young talent option that you could build around for the future. The Giants, they just drafted Theo Johnson in the 4th round this past year, but we know the Giants could definitely use a lot more weapons, especially if they are successfully able to get their quarterback of the future this offseason and give that guy weapons besides Malik Neighbors and give them another weapon in addition to Darius Slayton and Wandale Moore and Theo Johnson. I think Kyle Pitts could certainly be intriguing for that team. The Jets, the other team that plays in New Jersey, right? The tight end position has been a problem area for that football team for a number of years. They're going to probably trade away Devontae Adams this offseason. Garrett Wilson is disgruntled going into a potential contract year for him. They're going to do their 5th-year option and whatnot, but getting another weapon in there, another talented weapon in there makes a ton of sense for them. Washington, Zach Ertz, impending free agent. He's going to be 34 years old. We know that in their offense, a tight end is essentially a slot receiver. Good fit for Kyle Pitts. If they want Ertz back, but he's not a long-term option, Kyle Pitts could be. Dallas, Jake Ferguson, another contract year player. They need another weapon other than CeeDee Lamb in that offense. Jerry Jones loves a high-profile player. Why not take a flyer on someone like Kyle Pitts? Houston, Dalton Schultz, right? He's got 2 years left on his contract, but he'll be 29 this year. If you trade for Pitts, you give CJ Stroud another weapon. And, they've had kind of a revolving door of wide receivers there. Lots of injuries there. Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Stephon Diggs. Who knows what the wide receiver position is going to be? But you may be able to secure the long-term future of that tight end position, right? You have Schultz, you have Pitts this year, right? And then if Pitts performs, you can cut Dalton Schultz after the season, and then potentially Pitts is that long-term option that you can sort of stabilize that tight end position for years to come. Tennessee, for all the reasons that made sense for Cincinnati, you got Brian Callahan, a former Bengals coach there in Cincinnati, so similar offense where that tight end is essentially a slot receiver. We saw Mike Gesicki's usage, Hayden Hurst's usage in the past. Chiga Okonkwo is going into a contract year. You got to figure out what the quarterback situation, obviously, in Tennessee, but you couple, that quarterback with Kyle Pitts and Calvin Ridley, that's a healthier start for your offense moving forward. The Chargers are another team. We know Greg Roman loves a tight end, right? Now, traditionally, they want blocking guys, but Mark Andrews, when he was in that Greg Roman offense in Baltimore, was essentially a slot receiver. Over 60% of his snaps came in the slot, and basically you're envisioning Kyle Pitts to fill the role that you were envisioning for Hayden Hurst this year before he got injured, right? As that sort of slot that you could put Pitts into. So like I said, I think there are a number of teams that should be interested in Kyle Pitts. Whether or not they're going to be banging down the Falcons' door to get after Kyle Pitts, I think is probably a fair question to have. But I think there are enough teams with holes at the tight end position that, there should be a market for Kyle Pitts, right? And if they're not willing to wait for the 2026 production from probably a day 2 pick, I think Pitts is a smart bet for one of those teams to make to get some immediate returns and potentially, if Pitts performs, they get a long-term option. If he doesn't perform, those teams will have the ability to get the compensatory pick in 2026 anyway, if Pitts goes to the open market and gets paid and whatnot. So to me, it makes a ton of sense for a team to bet on, Kyle Pitts and the upside and whatnot. And so, I think the Falcons can hope to get a third for him. Maybe it's a fourth, maybe it's a fifth. As I've said before, I feel like if it's a 5th round pick, Kyle Pitts is more valuable to the Atlanta Falcons, even given his limited value that I think a lot of us look at in terms of, how can he blossom in this offense? Again, we're not talking about Zach Robinson. I know you guys have been waiting all day for me to take my shot at Zach Robinson. I'm not going to do that. We're just going to talk about Kyle Pitts on today. But if the best offer they are getting for Kyle Pitts is a 4th round pick, I'd probably take that if I was Terry Fontenot's shoes. I probably wouldn't if I was a 5th, because again, I just think, if that's your best offer, I'd probably rather take a player that can contribute a little bit more in 2025 than what a 5th round pick is. At least a 4th round pick, you can squint and say there's a chance we can find a starter there. In the 5th round, it's really hard to push that. Like, that's a backup. That's a special teams player. The 4th round pick is probably a backup and a special teams player, but at least there's a chance, especially if it's an early 4th round pick, that you might be able to get a plug and play start there from someone that fell from day 2 and whatnot at the beginning of the 4th round. So if the 5th is all you get, then again, that's where I'm like, give me a player, give me someone that can contribute, even if it's a player that, similar to Kyle Pitts, that's entering a contract year that you're probably not interested in paying for the team that's giving that player to the Falcons. I would take that and whatnot. So we know that this Terry Fontenot-led regime has been very active when it comes to trades, right? Since 2021, they've acquired 9 players via trade. They've traded away 7 players. So I do feel like there's a greater probability of a Kyle Pitts trade. As I've said before, again, I'm not sitting here saying it's 100% certain that they're going to trade Kyle Pitts. I would put the number at 60%. But again, I think that's a better than average chance that the Falcons do find a trade partner for Kyle Pitts this offseason. And I basically rattled off a third of the league that I think can make a decent case at the very least for trading for Kyle Pitts, and that's why I put that number as high as I do. But we'll see on that front, and we'll wrap up today's episode talking about, the implications of the salary cap shift. The league has set a range for the 2025 salary cap, and we'll talk about what it means for the Atlanta Falcons. So the league on Wednesday announced that the salary cap in 2025 will range somewhere between $277.5 million to $281.5 million. So we can split the difference and say roughly 279.5, roughly 280. And I saw previous projections for the most part were in that 275 range for the most part. So we're talking about maybe about $5 million more in salary cap space available to all NFL teams than what was previously projected. So not something that's going to move the needle in a major way, but it is at least something, right? And overthecap.com currently, which is I think probably the top website for, salary cap information and projections and all that stuff, is currently projecting the Falcons at being about $5 million over the salary cap. So they have to clear $5 million between now and March 12th in order to get under the salary cap. And that will be pretty easy for the Falcons to do. If they cut David Onyemata, that frees up about $8 million. So that will put them under the salary cap. And then the question is just going to be, and again, I've said this a number of times over the last month or two, I just kind of am assuming that David Onyemata is going to be cut. I don't know that for a fact, but I would be very surprised if we get to March 12th and David Onyemata is still on the Falcons roster, or let's say March 13th at that stage. So we'll see what other moves the Falcons make in addition to David Onyemata, because they'll probably need to make more moves because I think they'll need about $3 or $4 million to sign all the draft picks, and hopefully they'll get more draft picks. So that will increase that number. So there will be other moves to be made in the coming months, but they have a lot of cap flexibility to work with. It just depends on how active they want to be, right? They could cut guys in addition to David Onyemata. Grady Jarrett, cutting him would free up at $16.25 million. Caleb McGarry would be $14.5 million. Jake Matthews would be $9.2 million. Younghoe Koo would be $3 million. You could restructure guys like Chris Lindstrom, $10 million in savings. AJ Terrell, $9.6 million in savings. Jesse Bates is about $6.4 million. You could also extend some of these guys. Grady Jarrett would be an extension candidate, and depending on how you structure that, that's probably like $8 to $12 million in saving. Caden Ellis, you could probably save another $3 million if you gave him an extension. Of course, the trades of Kyle Pitts, that's almost $11 million in savings that you would have. Kirk Cousins, if you were able to get a trade partner between now and the start of the league year, you would between the now and the start of in March 16th, when you have that soft deadline of when that roster bonus is due, you would save about $2.5 million against this year's salary cap. So when you do all of this math, guys, the Falcons have potentially $85 million in salary cap flexibility that they have up to if they wanted to play with, right? This is why we say things on this podcast like the salary cap is a lie, right? It's not because the salary cap doesn't exist. Oh, it definitely exists. There are definitely consequences to manipulating the salary cap. But the point is, you can manipulate it, right? You can gaslight the salary cap, right? You can sit there and be that bad boyfriend and be like, you sound crazy, right? Here you go again. Oh, here we go. All right. Do you hear yourself? Like, what are you talking about? You're always so sensitive, right? I was just joking, man, right? And so you can gaslight the salary cap, right? Is that a healthy thing to do? No, it's not really a healthy thing to do. It's not healthy in a relationship. It's certainly not healthy because there are consequences down the road for gaslighting, manipulating the salary cap, right? The savings you make today, that those chickens are going to come home to roost, right? You got to pay that piper down the road. You got to borrow from Peter to pay Paul, all that sort of things. But the Falcons salary cap situation has never been dire. It's just a situation where it's enough of an issue where you don't expect the Falcons to be frivolous with their spending, right? They're not going to be making it rain at the club, so to speak. They're not in a position where they can just go ham and they just throw the bags at every player that they want this offseason, because there are consequences to gaslighting that salary cap, right? Those consequences can come back and bite them. And as you've heard me say over the years, it's really about winning football games, right? No one cares about how you manipulate the money as long as you're winning football games. But when you're not winning football games, that's when manipulating all that money becomes a problem, right? That's why the Falcons got rid of Matt Ryan. That's why everybody's freaking out about the Kirk Cousins contract, right? If the Falcons have finished the season 10-7, no one would be talking about, oh, this is a terrible Kirk Cousins contract, right? Not to say no one would be saying it. It would be just a lot less people talking about it, right? And so that's really the challenge for the Falcons. It's not about, the money. It's about winning football games, right? They can spend money this offseason, and if it helps them win the division in 2025 and make the playoffs, it's all good, right? You can go out there, and I've used examples where you could go out there and throw a bunch of money at guys like Josh Sweat and Milton Williams, two free agents this offseason, and backload those deals that have minimal cap consequences this upcoming season. But those cap consequences will, things will start to balloon in 2026 and beyond, right? And if you're coming off a 10-win season in 2025, you're like, all right, that's fine. We'll move that money around, and it's not going to be that big of a hassle in 2026 because, again, the Falcons have won games. But if they don't win games, let's say they come off another 7 or 8 win season, potentially people are getting fired. And the conversation we're going to be having this time next offseason is like, oh, Terry Fontenot hamstrung the new general manager because of his mismanagement of the salary cap, which is funny to me because like 6 months ago, I remember hearing so many people talk about how great a job Terry Fontenot had done managing the salary cap. And I remember people back in 2015 saying the same things about Thomas Dimitri. Oh, he's done a great job managing the salary cap. And I just remember telling people like, let's see what happens once they start paying guys on second contracts. That was the reason why the salary cap is easy to manipulate when you don't have to pay anybody, right? And maintaining the talent level of your roster when you don't have, you only have 1 or 2 guys that are making a bajillion dollars as opposed to 7 or 8 guys, it becomes a very different situation. And so that whole, like, this guy's good at managing the salary cap, to me, as a sort of thing to say about a general manager in a positive way, is just a whole bunch of BS. If you ask me, it's not really a high level skill to be able to manage the salary cap. Like, you can take, you can get an associate's degree, right? you can take a 3-hour course at a community college and be able to master the NFL salary cap. That's not a skill, right? It requires minimal ability, right? People are like, oh, Terry, he cleared the dead money. Like, the dead money is automatically cleared. Like, you just have to wait, right? Like, it's not a skill. Like, oh, he did a thing, all that stuff. So, as I said, it's really all about winning. That's all it is when it comes to if you're a good general manager or not. And ultimately, Terry Fontenot will remain the Falcons general manager beyond this year if they win. If they don't, he won't be, right? And so we can talk all we want about managing the salary cap. But again, at the end of the day, it's really all about winning. So those are my thoughts on how the salary cap, potentially influences the Falcons all season. Again, they can do whatever they want, whenever they want. And if they win, no one's going to care. Like, no one's going to be negatively judged. I will, because I'm going to complain about the Falcons any chance I get. But outside of me, outside of this podcast, no one will be complaining about the Atlanta Falcons. Then you guys will be like, you're nitpicking, Aaron, right? It's like, here you go again. Then you'll be gaslighting me. So we'll see what's what with the Falcons this offseason and what they do with the salary cap. We'll see what's what with Kyle Pitts. We'll have more to talk about on our next episode. More mock draft Mondays, and we'll probably start to get into the edge rushers now that I've started to watch these guys, and you'll sort of get my thoughts on that on Monday on our next episode of Locked On Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out all the great shows across the Locked On Podcast Network all weekend long to get you geared up for NFL draft, NBA, all that stuff and more. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.